Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Logistics Explained podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about dynamic pricing and specifically how dynamic pricing might work in the logistics sector. So we want to cover a broad range of aspects of logistics here, not just final mile. We want to be talking about potentially warehousing, freight and pallet networks too. So we've got some great panelists here today to help us with that discussion. First of all, we have Bridie O'Halloran, and she is the owner of BOH Sales Consultancy. She has a wealth of knowledge in the logistics sector, having held director level roles at many different major couriers and logistics companies. We also have Michael Anderson, owner of Place B Technology Consultancy. Michael also has extensive knowledge of the last mile delivery sector and has worked in major players for more than 20 years. And then finally, but by no means least, we have David Doolan. He is an expert logistics consultant, the founder of Exclusive Recruitment, and he founded that in 2003 and has since been working in the logistics sector over the last 14 years. So welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for joining the podcast today.
Thank you for having us.
Hello. Question we're putting on the table is, what is dynamic pricing? You know, we've all heard about it in the context of other industries, airlines, hotels and taxis, but perhaps if we go around the panel here and just get everybody's view on what is dynamic pricing. So maybe Dave, do you want to start first?
Yeah, I'm quite interested in this because I've had experience where I've been booking the same hotel, which is quite close where I live, for about 2 years. But it amazes me how much difference there is in the pricing. You know, it can be the same room can be from £60 to £130, and not just in, you know, the mad summer. And that's what's got me thinking about it. So there's my example of, you know, a dynamic pricing, charging a different rate for the same product, really.
Absolutely. And Michael?
Yeah, very similar to Dave, actually. My experience, blessed with having travelled a lot for work, and was less focused on it when it was effectively someone else paying, but always keen to try and get the best price. In the last couple of years, when it's been down to myself and working for a startup, I was absolutely stunned by the variance in pricing around going to similar destinations, very similar to you, Dave. Same places, but vastly different prices depending on when you were booking, how far in advance. If you didn't clear the cookies on your laptop, then you'd go back in and it would be always a higher price. But if you took them off, sometimes it would be a lower price. So it's piqued my interest. And in the last couple of years, as we're going to talk about, you're beginning to see the emergence of this, or the capability within certainly the parcel industry. And I think freight, particularly with export freight, air freight export, you're beginning to see it as well. But it's been quite crude, quite simplistic, and yeah, this is why we're talking today, because potentially the future offers a lot more opportunity in that area.
Thanks, Michael. And Bridie, do you have any kind of things to add to that? Anything you've experienced around dynamic pricing in other sectors?
Yeah, I think I think, well, I certainly think, actually, from a personal point of view, you know, being a single mum many years ago, and how long this dynamic pricing has been around, you know, to try and book a holiday in school holidays was literally double the price. So I think from that point of view, it's never changed. You know, it was always meant to change, but it never did change. So it meant that I always travelled with my children, you know, in school time, because that was my only option. And I think, you know, it's certainly clear that now with the tech that we've got available, it can be used elsewhere. I just think we need to be careful how we use it. I think it's my honest opinion.
Absolutely. And I think in logistics specifically, there has been kind of traditionally some constraints that have made it, you know, typically static or fixed pricing. Perhaps, Michael, maybe you've got something you can add to that?
Yeah, I think with the the capability within logistics. I mean, my area of real expertise is final mile. There would be an opportunity, and we were discussing it, I would say, almost 20 years ago within a parcel network. But understanding exactly where your capacity levels were within a network, you could do it. But if you started at 10 o'clock in the morning, you wouldn't have an answer until 12. You didn't have the degree of certainty that you had. So you were making too many assumptions about what that capacity actually was and where you wanted volume to go to. That's changed massively. And although there's plenty of legacy networks, and we'll talk about this differential between legacy and new networks, the legacy networks haven't really caught up. But if you look at some of the new networks around the world that have been created to cope with post-COVID, they're built from the ground up with a capability to understand exactly where their volume is going and exactly where their capacity is. So that's really opened up the opportunity to be able to say, actually, as a carrier, in the best interests of our operation and also in the best interests of service for the client, I can see that I am at capacity in this area. I can accept some more, but I can't price it in the way I would because the marginal cost of delivering that volume is that much higher. So it's tech-led, it's visibility. And I'll always, just to finish off on this, the example that really turned the light bulb on for me was on those rare occasions you take cash out of an ATM these days. By the time before you even get your card back out of the machine, you've got a text message from the bank saying you've just withdrawn £50. I haven't even got the £50 in my hand. So I haven't got the card in my hand, but I've been told that that's what's happened. Now, replicate that in a logistics environment. As soon as an order's made or a capacity input is received from somewhere in the network, you've got real-time visibility if you've got those systems connected. So that's where I think the industry is going, as long as those systems are in place.
No, that makes complete sense. So I think, Bridie, perhaps I know that you're looking at this often from a kind of sales lens. I guess traditionally static and fixed pricing makes it, well, it's what we've always had.
Yeah.
You think that is something? Do you see a constraint there if we were to suddenly start talking about using different prices under different scenarios?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, of course there is. Because it will just drive the same habits. And everybody's going to be fighting for that space, that delivery. So I think, yeah, and certainly, a legacy tout, you've had it like that because people want to know their budgets, they want to know what they're spending. But I certainly think because we have now got the technology there, it's about how do we make this work? And from my point of view, it needs to work for the customer as well as the carrier. And it's actually driving their behaviors around actually what works with us. So, I do see this, I see it as a great thing, but I'd probably be coming more for the sustainability factor of it, and actually leveling out capacity, because it's those empty miles that are costing, they're your silent cost. And I think actually anything we can do to drive space or obviously covering that space is going to be a benefit to everybody. But it's actually, how do you sell that to the customer?
Absolutely. And I think that kind of leads us quite nicely into the next point, really, which is kind of talking about what dynamic pricing in logistics might actually look like. I mean, ultimately, the customers here are typically, either, well, there's a broad range of customers, but from a final mile perspective, often like retailers. But there's a whole bunch of people in between. Perhaps, Dave, do you have a view of who in the supply chain specifically is likely to be able to leverage dynamic pricing, at least in the near term?
Interestingly, I've had a number of conversations over the last 3 days with some big cheeses in this industry, and thank you to those people. Yeah, and obviously they're all off the record. Yeah, and because a bit like Bridie, I'm trying to think from both parties. It's got to be both benefit, because if I benefit as a carrier and someone loses as the shipper, they're not going to ship. It's got to work for everyone, and if you can get it back to almost at the point of purchase or checkout, you've got two options. Say, right, you can get that parcel pallet delivered on Tuesday and it will cost X. But if you can live with it on Friday, it will cost you X less 20%, and that will drive activity and then fills those things up for the line hauls and carrying fresh air is the most expensive things we all know. And if we want to be greener, that ties in with it nicely as well. And I agree with you totally there, Bridie. And my perspective, and it's slightly cynical, but everyone wants to be greener, but no one wants to pay for it, and that's just true, sadly, but true. We all want the best deal we can. But when I spoke to people, because dynamic pricing is actually where, like Uber's a great example. It starts raining and the price goes up. It's brilliant the way to do it. It's not always great for you as a consumer, but it's brilliant the way it works. But I spoke to a couple of people, and one of the things they said was, rather than having dynamic pricing where the same price changes live, almost have variable pricing. So maybe have a different price for different times of the day, time of the week. So you might, because when the carrier or the pallet network or 3PL is slightly quieter, they would like to be packing more packets if it's the 3PL. The carrier would want to be, delivering, having their hubs full up, as would the pallet network and the members, So I think that's quite a good option. But on the back of that, one other thing to stop any potential abuse is, and one of the clients suggested, to maybe have some sort of zonal pricing, so they don't give you all the stuff for the awkward areas for them. If they do some delivery themselves, they don't give you the Highlands and Islands and Norfolk and Suffolk and maybe the Southwest. Yeah, so it's got to work for both parties. I think we agree on that.
Thanks, Dave. That makes complete sense. And actually, I think it ties in quite nicely to what Michael was saying earlier about the fact that, all of this, I mean, you talked about there about connecting the checkout. So the kind of person that's deciding who's buying the, which method of delivery they would like and which day of the week. Well, to make that really work, there needs to be, everything needs to talk, right? All the way from the checkout through to the carrier that's actually going to deliver the item in the case of final mile. So perhaps, Michael, you touched on this already, but what kind of data do we think is required to actually support dynamic pricing and make it something that is feasible in a, perfectly joined up world?
Yeah, it's a really good point around the capacity element, and I think that's one of the key aspects of what's required there, is to be able to say with real confidence that you will have capacity within this section of the network. Now, it doesn't have to be the absolute live capacity, but what you will have is trended data for a couple of years, whereas before if you wanted to hold a couple of years data, that's hundreds of millions of data points, and that was impossible 5 years ago. It's not now. With cloud computing, you can hold that somewhere. You can run the machine learning aspects to say, I have high confidence level that those depots in the far-reaching areas that Dave was talking about, Norfolk, Suffolk, the Southwest in the UK, the Highlands and Islands, I'm going to have this much capacity available. Or alternatively is I don't have capacity in those areas. So if I'm going to take an item, I'm going to have to charge more for it because I've got the marginal cost. We've talked a lot about fresh air, but there's a marginal cost of delivering extra, over capacity items. So the first element is that, okay, where am I today? Where am I tomorrow, the next few days, so that I can price accordingly and attract volume in on a Friday, because it's one of the quieter days of the week. And I'm still going to have roughly the same amount of resource because I can't just run it down. Then give me that volume. So that's the sort of the internal carrier element of it. the other element is what has just been touched on, which is the checkout, which says, okay, what can the checkout tell us about the buying behaviours now and previously, and how well is that checkout actually connected to the network? And a great example at the moment is lockers, because if you want to choose the locker that you want to go to when you're buying an item and you've chosen to have an out-of-home delivery, you don't ordinarily get the locker choice. You just get, it'll go somewhere, and that option is not connected now. I know Hubbox are working really hard with the likes of DPD and DHL and others to get that online, but that's the only one that I've seen, the only company that I've seen that's doing that at the moment. Now, there will be a Me Too of Hubbox, and therefore connecting the checkout to the capacity will happen, and that's a massive enabler, because at the moment the checkout is simply not connected to the network, even if it could be, even if you're buying directly from the carrier, if you're using a platform operation, for example. So those are the two elements. It's the capacity or the overcapacity in the network, and the checkout being able to replicate both the services of the client, the delivery options of the carrier in a way that makes it truly connected.
Can I just butt in there?
Yeah, please do, Dave. Yeah, please.
You are a CIO, so you're the expert in this sort of world. So, rather than us, mortals, is getting all those things connected, we like it when it's simple. Is it really, really hard to do, or is it, once you've got the gumption and the desire, is it relatively easy to connect them up?
I think it's becoming increasingly easy. In the old days, I say in the old days, I'm making myself sound like an old person now, but if you rewind the clock 10 years, most e-commerce stores were kind of homegrown, like bespoke build. They were agencies that were building e-commerce stores. Everyone was slightly different. They didn't really kind of have many shared components. Nowadays, a large section of e-commerce stores run on the same platform. For example, Shopify being the obvious example. So, somebody like a locker provider, we'll use InPost as an example. There's nothing stopping them from building applications that directly speak to their APIs that can be installed by any Shopify store, right? It's not like they have to have these expensive bespoke developments done anymore. So I think it's definitely becoming more possible. I think the other thing that makes it is an enabler is the ability for carriers to dynamically price for their customers. So, I know, Michael, you were at Metapack. This is something that Metapack's done for years, and that is kind of store a whole bunch of rate cards and figure out what the best, most economic way to ship something is. Well, nowadays, a lot of the carriers are exposing API endpoints that actually allow you to rate things in real time. And, that's helpful for a number of reasons, not least because there's a whole plethora of surcharges these days that you have to navigate, especially around kind of Christmas time and stuff. But I think that's just one example of where things are more connected than perhaps they were in the past. So is it easy? Probably not at the moment still, but is it moving in the right direction? Massively. We're a long way further forward to things being in real time than we were a decade ago. So I think that probably leads us quite nicely into the next point. And I just wanted to pick up on one thing that Michael said there that I thought was really interesting, actually. We're talking about this real-time data connectivity, this real-time flow of information. I think it's a really interesting and valid point that you could use historic data to model out what potentially is going to happen. It's quite a lot of the time, once you get to a certain scale, a lot of these things are very predictable, and that lends itself to this quite nicely and perhaps accelerates what might be possible in the short to medium term. So, yeah, I thought that's a really interesting point. Bridie, I was going to ask you next, actually. So things, obviously, we talked about Uber, people like Booking.com, the airlines. Have you seen any existing, in whatever shape or form, dynamic pricing in logistics so far? I know that you kind of have seen kind of Final Mile the pallet network side of things. Have you seen anything that kind of resembles dynamic pricing happening today
I
already?
think certainly, you've got haulage exchange, which I would say is your dynamic pricing of the haulage world. It's very much fixed on price. It's fixed on space, obviously, which is, we've already said, that's like your silent cost that we've got within the logistics industry. So I think that's quite key. But I think where we can actually move on from that, because that is just using anybody who has available space in that area. But I think if you're a network and you actually want to do something similar, but within your network and for your customers, then it's about just modeling that into what you're doing. And I think that's really key. I think there's lots of drivers to that. And where I see the real benefit of this is actually, it's not just filling the empty space, but we've also got a massive shortage of HGV drivers that's hitting us. And actually, we need to get a lot smarter with that. And I think dynamic pricing is probably a way forward with that as well. It's actually making great use of our great drivers every minute of every day and not sending them down the road with an empty trailer.
Thanks, Bridie. No, it's really interesting. It feels, a lot of the topics here feel to me a little bit like we're talking about, I mean, it is a market, right? We're talking about using price to drive behavior, whether it be a consumer, whether it be a kind of corporate client, a carrier, or somebody in between. We're talking about using essentially market dynamics to push activity around the market, filling up those busy days, filling up the empty days, making sure that the networks are maximizing their capacity. So no, I think it's a really interesting point. And I guess, we talked about it as from the benefit perspective of a network. We all come from the logistics world. What does it look like for the shipper, the client at the end of the start of the process, depending on which way around you look at it? What are the potential advantages of dynamic pricing for shippers? Perhaps, Dave, have you got a view on that one?
Well, yes, I have. And I tried and failed miserably to get a big shipper on here, actually, because just to understand what they really want. But I've had a few conversations with people. Almost behind all this is a big thing. It's called trust. Because, if you're the carrier, you open up yourself to let someone into your world, you need to trust them, they're not going to abuse it. And likewise, if you are the shipper and you've got X many parcels, pallets, picking, packing, for 3PL, you need to make sure it can be delivered. Yeah. So it's a trust thing on that. But I'd imagine if you're a shipper, if you think from a logistician's perspective, this time of year when it's really busy, you want to charge a bit more when you can, because having worked in the sector, once you get past the tipping point, it actually becomes more expensive to deliver parcels rather than less, which seems counterintuitive to people, but that's true. And that's why some carriers actually end up losing money this time of year when you think they've been making loads of money. But also from the shipper's perspective, they say, okay, right, when it's busy, we're going to pay a bit more, but when it's quiet, we want a bit off. So you've got to think from their perspective. So you've got to think, whether it be dynamic or variable, you've got to find some things that make it attractive for them to do it, which ultimately can come to the shippers when you and I and as consumers are purchasing. But it's got to be a real partnership where everyone benefits. Because if everyone doesn't, it's like anything. If both parties don't benefit, no one's going to be committed to it. Yeah. And if someone abuses it, someone else will stop it. That's it.
Yeah. Do you think it's fair to say that there almost needs to be a bit of I think one of the reasons it has to be mutually beneficial is that if there's always going to be a first mover here, right? There's always going to be somebody that does this first. And if it were not mutually beneficial, then that would just be like a commercial disaster for them, right? If they were doing something that the shipper was not happy about, they would just go and move to somebody else. In the UK, we have a pretty rich and dynamic market in pretty much all of these different areas of the supply chain. Michael, do you have any kind of further thoughts on the potential value proposition for shippers for dynamic pricing?
Yeah, I think the element that would make it work for both parties, and I think it will work for both parties, is around service performance, is giving real confidence about the delivery dates that you offer. And I think it's true to say, it's my opinion, and it just keeps getting reinforced that there is, when you look at the rankings that consumers and shippers give to the important attributes of a delivery service, price is always in the top one or two, and service performance is up there as well, and speed. But I think things have changed, and speed is really important, but it's the option of speed rather than just offering a next day service. And I think that's where the carriers can offer something that says, look, I can give you a far higher level of service if you allow me to be dynamic about the options available. And if you look at we're sat here in the UK. The UK is like a number of most European countries, in that next day has become the de facto service for deliveries in B2C, and less so in B2B, but still, if you're not offering that, you're not in the game. But fundamentally, if you look at the profiles of movements, they don't fall evenly on 5 days, the 5 working days of the week. And there's capacity there to be able to say that if you could post, and if you can take a delivery on a Monday or a Friday, I'll give you a better price, because that's going to take some volume out of those busy days. Give me a flat network where I can employ a far more confident level of resource to be able to deliver a service level that's high. So I think that would give a benefit to both, a huge benefit. And the other element that we haven't talked about yet, if you look at the parcel market, the growth in lockers is astronomical at the moment. That's a huge infrastructure investment by carriers. There will be a ceiling on those lockers, and the return on investment of those lockers has to deliver, because they're not free, and they want to fill them up, but they don't want to overfill them, because it's bad enough when you come home and you get the card. It's probably worse, or I say probably worse, I'm confident in saying it's absolutely worse when you're told, okay, it'll be in this locker, and you go there and it's not there because that locker is at capacity, or you're told on the way to the locker. And then what does the carrier do? Because then they've got to communicate to you. They don't have a default, I'll come back the next day. So I think it comes down to service as being the biggest lever that they can pull. And if a shipper gets a great service, reduces their Wizmo calls, then there's a really big win-win there. And just to add on that, price is very, very important. But once you're into a situation when you're buying regularly, if you're looking at 20p here or 30p there to give you confidence about where an item will be, and it'll be when I'm at home, then there's research out there that says, well, people will pay it, because for 30 pence, if that means I don't have to go out the door and I get a home delivery, or for 30 pence, I can go to the locker I walk past every day, but it's on a Monday rather than a Tuesday, then that's a small price to pay to get the service that you want.
No, thank you. That's an interesting perspective there. And actually, it does raise that question about, the expectation of shippers. Do they expect something additional, in whether it be in performance or convenience or something else in return for kind of taking on the concept of dynamic pricing? Maybe Bridie, how do you think that? I mean, you're well versed with trying to onboard new shippers and kind of retain them. How do you think that dynamic pricing might look to them? What would make it acceptable to them to be priced dynamically?
I think we've obviously touched on it already today, but I think sustainability is a buzzword, certainly with your larger shippers. So I think anything that gives them an option to lessen that, so lessen your CO2 footprint, is a benefit. So that's a massive benefit to the customer, but also to the carrier. So that's definitely a mutual benefit. And you already see this. You see this in Uber. Uber are doing it. They're always, you know, every time you get an option, you used to get an option of one vehicle or a larger vehicle. Now you've got an option of, you know, this is less CO2 miles if you use this vehicle, you know, electric vehicles, you know, we can go down those lines. But you've got Amazon doing it. You know, actually, if you have all your deliveries made on a Tuesday, then there's a cost benefit. There's a benefit, you'll get it for free. But if you want it next day, then you might pay a charge, or you have to be Prime. So it is actually being used, and that to me is a massive driver to me, because, you know, it's something that anything we can do, and we've all got targets to hit, as we know. You know, that's the carriers, that's the customers. Everybody's got a target to hit. And I think we also take it quite personal as well. And if you think you can do your bit by recycling your papers or you know, we do take it personal. So I think from a sustainability point of view, you are hitting everybody and be a mutual benefit to everybody. So that's my take from it. And
that's a really valuable point.
Yeah, it's certainly something I'm asked about in every meeting now. You know, what's your ESG plans? So it's definitely on everybody's mind.
Nice. That's a really, really valuable point. And actually, you know, Dave, you mentioned earlier that sustainability is something that everybody wants, but nobody wants to pay for. But maybe this is a mechanism by which, you know, everybody can have their cake and eat it as such.
Yeah,
definitely.